right. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Hurd with Build by Thrive Mortgage. With me, as always, I've got Natalie Roberts with Social Strategies. And we have our good friend, Melissa Nice Warner Daly, who joined us last year on one of our episodes with Homemade Austin. Welcome.
Welcome.
So we're going to start a new series here. We're all really excited about it, called The Road Home, Understanding the Path to and from Homelessness. With that, Melissa, please introduce us to our special guest here.
Yes, thank you very much. Today we are going to be discussing trauma because we feel like this is a good jumping off point for us because there isn't a single person who hasn't undergone some sort of trauma over the last 12 months. So please help me welcome Dr. Ashley Trust. She's with Integral Care. I'm going to read her bio for you. Dr. Ashley Trust is an assistant professor with the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Dell Medical School in Austin, the primary psychiatrist of Integral Care's Housing and Homelessness Services, and named one of Austin Monthly top doctors in 2021. She completed medical school at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston and her general psychiatry residency at the University of Texas Dell Medical School in Austin. She's also trained in cognitive processing therapy, a top evidence-based treatment for PTSD. She's dedicated her career to improving the quality of and access to care for individuals experiencing homelessness. Prior to working in Austin, she worked with homeless populations in Compton and South Central Los Angeles with the LA Department of Mental Health. Welcome, Dr. Trust. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
We wanted to kick off just by having you talk a little bit about trauma and the various kinds of trauma there are.
Yeah, so trauma is it's a very complicated topic. And if you look at it just as simplistically as you can, it's just this one distressing or dangerous or defining moment where you feel like your life is threatened. You may feel like someone you know or close to's life is threatened, or you're in a situation where you feel powerless or helpless to escape, a life-threatening situation. And so that's actually what trauma is. And there's different ways in which one can experience trauma. And then there's different types of trauma, like you brought up. So acute trauma, which means it's one episode that happens. So I think all of us can relate to an acute trauma. Being here in Texas, we all went through this recent winter storm. And I think all of us can look back on that and say that was a pretty traumatic event. But then there's something called chronic trauma, where you have these prolonged or long episodes that can happen again and again, or you're kind of stuck in a situation where you're experiencing that trauma and you can't escape it. And then there's complex trauma, which is a little bit of both. And so you're experiencing kind of these acute episodes, these small traumas in time, in addition to repeated and chronic trauma. So those are the different types. You kind of wanted to put it into categories.
Yeah, and can some people, are some people inherently able to deal with trauma or better equipped than others, or do you find?
That's an interesting question. So actually going through a trauma, we all go through it, and actually we all have the same reaction. So when we go through some of these events, so put yourself in that situation. What do you feel? You start feeling your heart beating really fast, or all of a sudden you go blank, right? You can't remember what's happening. You start breathing really fast. Your heart's beating, you're sweating. And that happens to everyone. So we all have the same type of reaction. And that's because our brain is smart. We're survivors. We're humans. We want to survive.
It's that fight or flight mentality.
Exactly. That's exactly what it comes down to. So your brain goes automatically into fight, flight, and actually freeze is the other one. So, and that's to help you survive. So actually blood flows away from your brain. It flows away from your stomach and goes into your arms and legs. So that's really why that you have that experience. And it's to help you, but not everyone's fight or flight or freeze looks the same. And so sometimes that can look like irritability, anger for some people for that fight part versus actually physically fighting. The flight can look like obviously running away, but it can look different too in that you're isolating. You don't want to be around people. And then freeze is how it sounds. You kind of freeze and stand still because you're helpless. You don't have anywhere to go. And if you freeze, you can survive in that moment. And so that's kind of how that happens. And we all go through that, but sometimes, that feeling, those reactions go away in time. Like imagine seeing a scary movie. You can kind of have all those reactions when you see it, but then you think back on it and you're like, man, that was a scary movie, but it doesn't really scare me right now. But what happens when you have a traumatic event is that those feelings, it's like being in that scary movie in that one scene, experiencing it over and over and over again. And that's what PTSD is. It prolongs, it goes for a longer amount of time. So it's not just in that moment, it stays with you for over a month, years, to a lifetime.
And can just anything trigger you? I mean, triggers they cannot be associated at all, right, with that trauma.
Exactly. So what's interesting is that you go back to that moment, right? Because it's tied with such a strong emotion, but anything can trigger that memory. So let's say it has to do with, let's say you have an experience where you were in a house fire, for example, right? And so now let's say you're walking down the park, right? And you live in Texas, so someone's going to be cooking some barbecue somewhere, I assume. But let's say you smell some smoke. And instead of thinking, man, that could be some good barbecue, all of a sudden now what happens is your body thinks, I need to survive. That's a trigger. So all those feelings come back, all the thoughts associated with that traumatic event, like I'm unsafe, I don't know what to do, I need to escape, come back. And so you're triggered just by that. So it used to be something that may have been, a happy experience, but now it's triggering. And that could be smells, sights, sounds now are triggers.
I'm just going to keep asking questions until y'all jump in. Go for it, Brian. I saw you.
Hey, I did tell you all that this is going to be a huge learning experience for me, right? And I absolutely honored to be a part of this podcast, but I think a lot of it's just going to be me listening, which, as Natalie will tell you, is probably pretty rare.
Very.
But yeah, I mean, you're probably going to have to talk a little bit more. Yeah. And then, trust me, we'll jump in. So
I know one question too, just, meeting you, Ashley, for the first time and hearing your background and talking triggers. Was there a specific moment that put you in the space where you knew this is what you wanted to do and this is where your heart and your passion were? And if so, sharing that with us, so I think we have a further understanding.
That's a great question. When I was in training, I worked with a lot of individuals experiencing homelessness, and my heart, actually, it sounds real cheesy when I say it right now, but I felt really bad because sometimes we don't have all the answers and we definitely don't have all the resources. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you see people that you want to get better, that you're rooting for, and they end up in situations where there are not a lot of resources for them to succeed. And so after training here in Texas, I went to Los Angeles, and there I worked on Skid Row. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Skid Row. So it's basically, or I at least went to Skid Row a couple times, and just being a part of that, immersing myself in that environment and seeing that there is an opportunity to be helpful and to do something, but just by being present and being a good physician at that point. And I knew I wanted to provide guess, good quality care to these individuals. And it's hard because I think, there's different routes to go. You can
Mhm.
definitely practice different ways of medicine, but I think after seeing all of that, I ended up in that direction, and I've really appreciated it too. I've enjoyed it.
And that's
Well,
beautiful. I mean, just the hands-on experience, I think, is what drives most human purpose, right? Being, like you said, in Skid Row, and maybe just real quick, and not to interrupt, an explanation of, for those that might not know, what is Skid Row, and a quick explanation of maybe how we talked about tying through to the triggers. How does that feel? How does that smell? What are these people living in?
Yeah. So my experience with Skid Row, because I was there and then I was also in South Central, so more of an area of Los Angeles that experienced a lot of crime and had a lot of minority populations. So I'll kind of explain the two. So within Skid Row, it's imagine a neighborhood. It's generally a neighborhood. It's a part of downtown. It's off of downtown Los Angeles, and the sidewalks are sort of lined up with tents and cardboard boxes, etc. And it is basically a town of homeless individuals. And there are some public bathrooms there and areas to kind of wash your hands and such. But it's very crowded. But what's interesting is there's a sense of community in there too. Everybody knows each other. You walk down and they're like, "Hey, Doctor such and such," or they remember you when you come down. And so that's kind of to bring the human element to it as well. But it's unlike something I can really describe because it's just like a neighborhood like any other, but just I guess without houses, without anything. And people are sick and in wheelchairs, and I mean, obviously, the smell isn't great, but it's interesting in that sense. And then South Central LA, where I worked and where I did most of my work, it's mostly minority, so people of color, Black and brown individuals, and a lot of crime and violence. And so I guess it looks different in that people are kind of living in houses, a whole bunch of people living in one house, living in their cars, living on the street. I had patients taking trains and public transportation so they could sleep and feel safe just during that time, and then getting off because you can't be sleeping there the whole time. And so it's quite interesting to have been a part of that. And I look back and it's the feeling that brings me back more so than the sights and the sounds. But it's the feeling and just being like, how resilient are some of these people that are experiencing this? So
I'm really interested in trauma-informed care, and maybe if you could share a success story for us of how you've used your tools to help people navigate through trauma and to stabilize. And, I think when someone ends up living on the streets or in a homeless shelter, they have such a pile of layers of issues, right? And trauma is oftentimes like somewhere at the bottom or sometimes at the top, depending on, that's the thing we would always tell folks, like, if you haven't experienced trauma by the time you hit the streets, like, you're definitely going to experience it on the streets because it is that constant everyday fight or flight or freeze. So to come back to the question, if you can talk to us about trauma-informed care and how you've helped people navigate through trauma.
Yeah. So as you brought up, trauma is basically, I think, at the foundation of most people experiencing trauma. There's plenty of research and studies that show that at least 80% of people that are experiencing homelessness have had a traumatic event or have experienced trauma before they were homeless. And a lot of that actually happens in childhood too. So we have to think back on, we're looking at adults right now, but a lot of this happened in childhood. And that trauma there has
compounded, right?
Right, compounded and created, their coping skills and how they live to the point where they are now. And so trauma-informed care is recognizing that. So you're already good at trauma-informed care. You're already starting off on a good foundation. But it's understanding that if you have experienced trauma from the very beginning and you're experiencing it over and over and over again, right? That some of your reactions to things, we talked about the flight or fight, they're because of the trauma, not because you're maybe being mean or malicious intentionally. Um, and also because it's also knowing that they're not doing anything wrong. Like, oh man, you're doing stuff wrong. Like, we're here to support and show their strengths. So, making sure that we support their strengths and lift up the strengths, recognizing the trauma, making sure your staff recognizes trauma and how it relates to the behavior. And safety is a big part of that too. Creating a safe relationship between our patients and ourselves, because that's a big thing that's been lacking for a long time, is trust and safety. So creating safe and trustworthy relationships and creating a safe space, which is often very difficult with our patients. I guess when you think about success stories and things like that, well, the first thing is that here in Austin, I work with an amazing team with Integral Care, and they work very hard to house a lot of our patients pretty quickly. And so we recently, or I can't say specifics, I don't want to be too specific because of patient confidentiality, but what I will say is that the first part is engaging and getting people to trust you, and that is the hardest part. We have staff that go out like downtown and go out into some of our churches and other places and go out and try to engage and say, hey, why don't you work with us a little bit? Or why don't you talk to our psychiatrist? Or why don't you? And it can take months, years. It can take a very long time to.
Well, trust doesn't come easily, I think, to anybody. And I think you're dealing with people that have this long standing trauma. So, I mean, that has to be exponentially more difficult and take more time.
Exactly. And I think that there's a lot of frustration maybe because people are like, why don't people just get into care and, get the housing and whatnot? But, that's easier said than done when your whole life you couldn't trust anyone. And so then you have someone coming out and trying to get you to, quote, trust them and move you into a new place, or making, quote, promises maybe that don't happen. And
Right,
so it's difficult. But that, although it's difficult, doesn't mean it's impossible. And so it's happened that we've been able to work with some of our patients, get them into housing. And once housed, I have a couple of patients that have now started jobs and are working to maintain their housing. And I think those are big successes.
That's huge.
And what we, have to remember is that it's not always the huge successes. Sometimes it's like, okay, we got someone to talk with us today and they're coming to see me and we did it, and we all have to remember that it just takes time and it's a journey.
I think that's right. Because a lot of us, well, all of us, none of us see the backstory. We don't see the origin story of someone who ends up on, the streets or ends up without housing. And it takes years to get there. I mean, very seldom do you overnight become homeless. And then it's years of trauma, and then there's addiction and abuse and all the other things that can fold into that. And it is, I imagine you have to be very patient in your profession to, trust the process and keep it moving forward to help people stabilize.
Yeah, patience is the key. And I think empathy as well. And kind of asking that from the community too,
We talk a lot about that, turning empathy into action.
Right. And it's a hard process. But it's very rewarding. And I've really enjoyed seeing those big steps, but taking those small steps, I'm learning to enjoy just as much.
So I've got a couple questions for you. So we talked about being patient and, obviously there's different types of trauma, right? There's the instant, the scary movie or the roller coaster type, but then there's the more deep rooted stuff, and in your experience, those that are homeless, is their trauma typically over and over and over again? Is it much more deep rooted than the traditional sense?
So, most of my patients, I will say, have had trauma growing up. So, they started off from the beginning with some sort of trauma. Now, was that because they grew up homeless?
Yeah.
Maybe, but some of them were neglected, which is another kind of that hopeless, powerless feeling when you're a kid and not having any sense of safety. And a lot of what happens is that drives you run away from home, and then there you go. There's the trajectory towards homelessness. So I will say, or there's some sort of domestic violence. A lot of our female experiencing homelessness, a lot of domestic violence is what leads to the path there. But there's a lot of trauma that happens before they're homeless that, can happen to anyone. But it's about the resources and the support that you have. But once you are homeless, I guess you can say, then there's a whole nother set of trauma, like you're growing up, right?
Sure.
Like, so I was talking, I've talked to patients, and one of the questions I ask typically is, how are you sleeping? How are you eating? Because those are questions, you typically ask, but she's like, do you know what it's like to be so cold that you can't feel your hands or your feet? How am I supposed to sleep?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, and you mentioned resources, and that's really kind of my second question is, so, our society is kind of tempered to believe that we need to fix everything here and now, or at least try to fix what we can fix here now, the viruses or whatnot, without truly looking at what the root cause is. How do we change that mentality? How do we look at a scenario and go, okay, if trauma is truly one of the major factors that can lead to homelessness, how do we get people to understand that we've got to start fixing root causes of these things rather than just kind of railing on homelessness by itself? And it's kind of an open-ended question, but
that's the question. I think, how do we? I think when people see individuals experiencing homelessness, I don't think trauma is the first thing that they think of. And if you also think of a kid experience, if you thought of this adult as a child experiencing homelessness, I'm sure we'd all be like, man, we need to do whatever it is that we need to do to help that kid. Yeah. But that's what you're seeing. You're seeing that kid. That's just as an adult. If you never had the opportunity to have a nurturing, safe environment, you're still that kid. Mm-hmm. You're still acting like that kid, or potentially coping with some of those skills because you never had the opportunity to learn and mature in that way. And so maybe if we could help people see that through podcasts like this, but I really think it's that outreach portion and bringing that human aspect to things that's going to help people change their mentality. But another thing is the safety portion. So trauma is at the root, but we can't fix trauma if people don't feel safe.
Sure.
And if you're homeless, the number one thing that is going to make you feel safe is a safe place to stay. And that's where housing comes in and is one of the most important factors in helping these individuals get better towards stability. And so even though I'm a psychiatrist and I've been, trained in, medicines and such, what has been a humbling experience for me is understanding that if I could write a prescription for some housing, I think that would be probably the best thing that I could do, at least to start off. And that's one of the treatments, or one of the mentality that we have with the clinic that we have in trying to provide or help our patients get housing?
Well, and I would think initially, just that safe haven, that safe place,
Right.
so to speak.
Foundation.
But then, I think that would progress to confidence. This is something that I can build. This is my foundation. This is my bedrock that I can use to build off of. And I think, housing can provide, tremendous benefits for a number of different reasons.
Yeah, you say confidence, and there was another study that said that one of the two biggest risk factors for individuals not being able to maintain housing was trauma and low self-esteem. And so it's that confidence piece. So being able to maintain or have housing, feel safe, and then feel like a part of society
Yes.
is huge.
Yeah, I think it's that reintegration part, that reintegrating into society and becoming just a part of that fabric. Because we talked about this in the intro, just that, we have this, misconception that we end up on the streets and you're all alone, but you build a community around you, but it's creating healthy spaces for people so that they can move from surviving to hopefully thriving. And what is some of the more maybe successful or interesting supportive housing you've seen? Are any trends that are coming up lately that I'm fascinated to know about?
Yeah. So specific clinic is called the Terrace at Oak Springs. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It's the first Housing First initiative within Central Texas. So basically the model is, like we're talking about, using housing as the main treatment. And so homeless individuals are housed without that expectation that, okay, you have to do substance abuse treatment. There was no stipulation. You just get the housing. But in addition to that, it's like supported housing. So there are people on staff that are helping rehabilitate these individuals. I mean, can you imagine?
Can't do it alone. I couldn't imagine.
Yeah.
And it takes time.
Yeah.
How do you pay bills? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you furnish a house? Those become stressors once you do get a house. So it's that supportive piece. Once you have the housing, it's definitely a process. So housing first, but then the support there to help move forward. So I've definitely seen that. What we've seen with this Housing First initiative with the Terrace at Oak Springs is that it's cut down on psychiatric hospitalization stays, use of EMS, because traditionally crisis going to the ER is how you're getting medical care, psychiatric care. But if you have housing and support, you find that those resources are not being used as much. So it's cutting down on a lot of those costs because people are feeling safe, being able to maintain their medications, or just being able to get a job and live life. So there's a lot of success, both just within the individuals, but we're seeing it's helpful for the city. It's helpful as well because they're saving money. We're
taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
Everybody wins.
But it's when, as we've been talking about people or telling people that we're going to do this series, everybody goes, well, what's the solution?
Right.
And I don't know what that is,
Good
but
point.
I think what's really fascinating is just learning, and as I mentioned, this is going to be a big learning experience for me, but the things that I take for granted, like you mentioned, furnishing a house, going to get prescription medication, all of these little simple things, paying a utility bill that we do every day, we've done every day.
Getting a driver's license to be
All
able
of
to
those
do
things.
all of
Oh,
those
that's a
things.
huge
Right.
one.
Normal
Driver's license?
functionality.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, that it's crazy, but I think the more we can learn, what these people are going through, the better we can understand it, and then hopefully collectively come up with solutions for it.
Well, and that's a good point too. When we start to think of, all of the efforts that go into lifting a human being off the street, right, and addressing the mental, addressing all the issues that might come up with that, and understanding that with empathy. My question, Ashley, would be, how does your team identify, work with, integrate? Where does that process start in the homeless community and helping?
Yeah. So people better than myself. So we have outreach teams. So
Okay.
the main purpose of these outreach teams, so there's integral care is a huge entity, but within the housing and homeless service kind of umbrella,
Mhm.
we have outreach teams, and these outreach teams go and just their purpose is to go out and to meet people that are experiencing
Amazing.
homelessness and just say hello, how are you, how can I help you, and with no strings attached, and trying to engage. And we have a team called Host. I think that's the name of the team. They go out and they're in kind of more downtown area, but and there's other teams as well, but they work in that capacity and just trying to be like, hey, I identify with this organization, but I'm just here to help you and
That's awesome.
put a face to what we do and build some trust. And that's how that happens. That's how we get some of our patients.
And then from there, is it just it furthers with the trust and the connection and digging into understanding what type of trauma or if trauma has occurred that start to build to get to that position where you're able to have the conversation. Is that where the connection comes past that point?
Yeah. I think that's where that trauma-informed care comes from.
Okay.
I think just in kind of understanding the trauma piece is really hard to get to because we're all very guarded with whatever trauma we have. I think every individual has experienced some trauma and we don't want to tell anybody, just anyone about it. And so normally that's not even shared. It's just kind of an understanding that, okay, I know that you're experiencing trauma because you're homeless and this right here is traumatic. So it's more of that understanding and again, with that trauma-informed care, just trying to make those trusting relationships and build on their strengths.
Why are people so hesitant to talk about their traumas? I mean, is it a trust issue? Is it a feeling of helplessness or weakness? What's the cause?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's all those things. So with trauma, when those things happen, so when you're in a life-threatening situation, what happens, not only does not only does blood kind of flow away from your brain, but also you have thoughts that are automatically coming to you. So those thoughts that usually happen are the world's unsafe. I can't trust people. Sometimes you're like, I'm not worthy. There's different automatic thoughts that happen during those events. I think we can all kind of relate to that.
Absolutely.
In some way. Yeah. And so if you think like that during that event, imagine living that event over and over and over again. You're going to believe that. It's ingrained in you. So then when someone comes and tries to make you think differently, you're not going to believe that. Or you're not even going to trust that because you have grown up with that sense of that is now who you are and what you truly do believe. And so, 30, 40, 50 years of feeling that way, it's going to take a while to break that down and to allow someone to really believe you can trust someone when everyone has let you down or you felt everyone has let you down.
But I imagine that outreach with no strings attached, just the simple being seen and heard is so, life-changing and really helps move the conversation forward. I imagine I just feel like the work I've done and by changing the way people see themselves, it creates this immense amount of hope and you can achieve so much more. I mean, that's the real life-changing stuff is just changing the way people see themselves and interact with the environment around them.
Yeah. And again, I think we talked about the housing and that confidence. It really does when you give people a sense of power, like I'm confident, I have something, it can really be life-changing when you haven't had anything for so long.
You start to feel unstoppable, like, hey, I can do this, I can break free, and maybe that cycle isn't something I have to live within every single day.
Exactly. It's, and what you start noticing in this work is that when those shifts and the framework of how you think about things, that's a win too. So, you think about all those different steps it takes to get someone to trust you, to get them into housing, to, you know, continue to trust you enough to go through the process of maintaining that housing. But it's possible. And
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that you can actually rewire the brain. I mean, we used the last organization I worked for, we used running as a means to rewire the brain. And it's incredible what you can reteach yourself to feel and to think.
yeah, and essentially that's what trauma therapy does. It we talked earlier about those connections. With that moment your body feels a certain way and you have these thoughts, but what you want to do is unconnect those so that it turns into a memory again. It's like, yeah, those bad things happened, but it was a bad thing that happened. It's like a reel now in your brain, like a movie reel, versus you're living in the moment, you're having that experience. So trying to unconnect that and get unstuck in a way.
I was talking with a friend of mine who's a firefighter, and she was going to a therapy session, and I don't know what it's called. It's something to do with the eyes, but it's
EMDR. Yeah.
There you go. Oh, yeah. I thought that was so fascinating as a way to, I mean, because they see some very traumatic things on the job, and
Yeah.
she said it's been helping.
And no, definitely EMDR. There's several forms of trauma therapy, and I think that's what's fascinating too, is that we talk about homelessness, and I think when I first talked to you, I said we're all just one step away.
Absolutely.
We're all just one step away, and so it's not like a novel treatment for any one particular individual versus the other. We all can benefit from these treatment options. But yeah, it's phenomenal what therapy can do for trauma.
Yeah.
So how do we move forward? Again, I know that's a really tough question, but as we're kind of coming up on the last 5-10 minutes or so, maybe talk about some ideas that you have, or really just talk about what casual people like myself can do to help be a solution.
Yeah, that's a big question. I always talk about if I had a magic wand. That's how I like to, talk to my patients sometimes, because not everything is attainable at the time. But I think about future goals. So if I could use that magic wand right now, I would like to say that if we could create the opportunity for more homeless individuals to have these supportive housing experiences that are also staffed with people that understand that trauma is at the root, and be able to provide very trauma-informed services while being at these supported housing places, I think that could make a world of difference, because trauma, it does go back to substance use. It goes back to people going back into homelessness once they are housed. It's just not being able to have simple conversations on the phone about bills because it's too frustrating and it triggers them, right? So we really have to get to the trauma to be able to, like you said, rewire the brain, to be able to develop new skills, to be able to integrate.
Imagine, is there some level of comfort in if trauma has become your normal? You've lived on the streets and then you find yourself in housing, and then do you find the rate of people going back to homelessness is because it's something familiar?
Definitely. I think there's frustration sometimes, and that we're like, why, you got the housing, why are you still, what's going on? And it's because there's still trauma there. You still don't feel safe, right? Those feelings are still there. I have patients that still sleep on the floor when they're housed, still don't trust anyone and don't leave. So then you don't get a job, and then you can't get the housing. So I mean, it's a cycle. But like I said, I think if first you feel safe with the house, then we get to the trauma to help you understand that maybe the world's not so scary, and then integrate at that point.
And I think one of the ways we do that is get people interested, whether that's somebody that's going to, kind of follow in your path, Dr. Trust, or, somebody that just wants to help, organizations like Homemade, and I think the best way we do that is educate ourselves and what the real challenges and problems are,
Yeah, definitely. I think the more the community works together, I think you saw in the winter storm how the community just came together and they helped everyone. And I think that if we all come together for the common cause
It's amazing. We can do anything.
we really can. It's evident. We've seen it. And this is a problem that if we come together that we can see change. I think it's not something that's unattainable. We can, if we work together, we can see something. I'm not saying that everything will be all better, but I think there is change that can be made if we do kind of look at the root cause, like you were saying. And I do believe that trauma is a huge, if not the main cause of what's going on.
Well, and I think, I think it was a good analogy of the winter storm. I mean, I think you saw people genuinely wanted to get out and help each other.
Right.
It was a phenomenal thing to see, so many Texans helping other Texans. And I think people really want to help, with homeless, but whether it's a politically charged conversation or whether it's just lack of knowledge of how, I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers that you see. And I think that's where we need to see, leaders, like yourselves kind of leading that charge and telling us, hey, we want to, we know you want to help. Here's how to get involved, and I think that's what we need desperately.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think going back to the winter storm, because what I like about that analogy is we can all relate to it.
Yes.
And what was interesting during that time is I think we all felt like almost that powerlessness, like I don't know what's going to happen, right? And because we all felt that, we all decided to help each other because we all felt it. We knew it. We were so close to it. The further removed we are from a situation, the harder it is. And that's with anything, with any of these situations, these politically charged situations, the further away we are, we're just like, I don't want to do, but
you're less likely to walk a mile in another man's shoes, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so, they say Texas strong and Austin strong, and we were, and I believe that the more that we can put ourselves, like you said, in another person's shoes and get to that place where we were there. And we saw what that did, and that was phenomenal.
And I think it forced people literally outside. I mean, your phone wasn't working, your power was out, you checked on your neighbors, and you rallied in with food and whatever resources you had, and we survived it together, some more than others, I think.
Right. And that's where the trauma piece is, like some more than others.
Right. There's a universality to it, but also definitely it was very individual, and privilege, sets us apart, I think, in how we were able to navigate through that week. But I just so appreciate this time together today. I have learned so much, and I thank you so much for everything you continue to do on the ground to lift up our most vulnerable neighbors. And just really proud to be sitting next to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Trust.
Thank all of you for listening to me and for being a part of this. Thank you.
I told you I wanted to learn, and I did tell you I would ask questions. So it just took me a little while to get the all hands to wheel moving. But yes, Dr. Trust, thank you so much for joining us, and we're absolutely honored to be a part of this discussion with you.
Yeah, thank you.